In Luke 22:25, Jesus said, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. That word exercise authority is from kuriou in the Greek. It means to be master, to rule, to control, to have dominion over. The word authority is from exousiazo, and it means the right or power to do with something or someone as one sees fit. And we all know that's the way it is in politics with secular government. We have a police force to force people to do things they don't want to do. That's the authority Jesus was talking about. That's the lordship that is exercised in the world. Because of that, political government attracts power junkies who enjoy forcing other people to do things. We're talking about authoritarian leadership, a top-down power structure where in the first century the Caesars had total decision-making power, absolute control over their subjects. But then Jesus says in verse 26, but not so with you. When he said you, who's he talking to? The 12 disciples. Now, by extension, that applies to church leaders today also. In verse 26, Jesus went on to say, rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest. Now, when you think of the youngest person in a social group or in a family, that is the person with the least authority. So if you look at this picture here, the youngest person there, how much authority does that little fella have in that family? The least. And then Jesus goes on to say, within the church, the leader should be as one who serves. And so when you look at this picture, you've got the table server and her employers. Who is an authority there? Who has the least authority there? How much authority does this table server have over those she's serving? 0. And then Jesus asks a question in verse 27. For who is greater, the one who reclines at table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? And then in verse 27, Jesus said, I am among you as the one who serves. So in that picture, Jesus is the one standing, serving the others. In Mark chapter 9, verse 34, the disciples were arguing about which of them would be greatest in the kingdom. And in the middle of that argument, Jesus said, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. We find that hard to believe. Really? Is he just speaking in hyperbole here? Did he really mean that? Well, I'm going to argue he did, because in Matthew 20, verse 28, for example, we read, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. So we're talking about servant leadership. Leadership that through persuasion builds consensus. And persuasion involves patience and listening and empathy. These are all part of how leaders serve the church in building community, building consensus. It takes great humility to do that. Philippians chapter 2, verse 5 says, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant. So I'll give you a test. Which person in this picture best represents Jesus, based on all that he said? Well, it's obviously the one standing, serving. Right? Let's apply it to us. Which person in this picture should represent church leaders? Same answer, the person standing, serving. So it's a completely different mindset than what we see in the world around us. Church leadership is not the same as secular leadership. As you know, Jesus washed the disciples' feet. Why did he do that? Well, I'll let him tell you. John chapter 13, verse 14. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should also do just as I have done to you. A servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Now that's the blessing I was talking about. Jesus said you will receive a blessing from God if your management style as a church leader is the same as that style that Jesus had. So do you want God's blessings on your ministry as a church leader? Then you need to do what Jesus modeled and lead with a servant's heart. Again, we're talking about servant leadership. Leadership that builds consensus through persuasion, through teaching, through listening, through explaining over and over and over again if necessary. So, for example, when we look at servant leadership, we're talking about a participative management style that invites input and builds consensus. You don't want decisions made by the leadership behind closed doors and then announced to everyone else from on high. That's not the idea. We're talking about servant leadership that is concerned for the interests of others. What's best for the church? That acts on the priesthood of the believer. Acts like it really believes that. That respects the wisdom of all the brethren and listens to what they have to say. This type of leadership sells more than it tells. It leads the flock. It does not herd the flock. So in that sense, church leaders are like shepherds, not cowboys. It is not my way or the highway. It is not leaders preserving the best place, but rather loving people the best way. It is all about consensus rather than command. So let's review. When we look at a church leader's authority, how much authority does a church leader have? The answer basically is none. The same authority as children and as slaves. We're talking about servant leadership.